Imagine being told your mailbox ruins the entire neighborhood's vibe. That's exactly what my HOA did. But instead of backing down, I declared war, medieval style. So if they thought my mailbox was ugly before, wait till they see the castle I built around it. It was just another Thursday morning when I found the letter stuffed into my mailbox, a thick white envelope with the bold HOA letterhead stamped in red. The moment I saw it, I knew it wasn't good news. They never sent letters unless they were ready to nitpick something ridiculous. I ripped it open, read the first line, and felt my blood pressure spike. Your mailbox does not meet the aesthetic requirements outlined in Section 5B of the Community Standards and is hereby deemed unsightly. Unsightly? My mailbox? I blinked at the letter and looked over at the perfectly average black metal box standing at the end of my driveway. Yes, it was slightly tilted from last winter's ice storm. And sure, maybe the paint had chipped a bit on the side, but it was a mailbox, not a front porch chandelier. It did its job, held mail, didn't fall over, didn't bite anyone. In my book, that made it fully functional. But clearly, the HOA thought otherwise. They included a full-page recommendation list of acceptable mailbox designs, complete with photos that looked like they were taken straight out of a luxury catalog. White pillars, bronze filigree, custom wood engravings. It looked more like suggestions for a billionaire's country club, not a middle-class suburban neighborhood. And of course, there was a 7-day deadline to fix the violation, or I'd be fined $100 per day. I sat at my kitchen table, rereading the letter in disbelief. The audacity. Of all the things happening in the neighborhood, kids leaving bikes all over sidewalks, cars parked illegally on curves, overgrown lawns, my mailbox was their target. It wasn't the first time the HOA had overstepped. 2 months earlier, they'd sent a warning to my neighbor for having excessively festive holiday decorations because her wreath had lights. Another family got fined for painting their shutters blue instead of the approved beige. It was as if the HOA had made it their mission to suck every ounce of personality out of the neighborhood. Everyone was supposed to fall in line, match the same mold, and live like carbon copies of one another. No individuality, no quirks, just the illusion of perfection. But here's the kicker. I'd actually tried to play by the rules. Last year, when my old mailbox rusted through, I replaced it with one from the hardware store that, according to the listing, met USPS and HOA standard dimensions. I even checked the community guidelines to make sure it wasn't some wild color or illegal height. I did everything right. And still, here they were, calling it ugly and threatening me with daily fines. I walked outside and looked at my offensive mailbox again. It was still standing proud, still holding yesterday's credit card offers and grocery store flyers. I crouched down, checked the screws, and gave it a little shake. It wobbled slightly. Okay, maybe it could use a stabilizing brick at the base. But it wasn't falling apart. I took out my phone, snapped a few pictures, and scrolled through them. Nothing unusual, nothing offensive. But then again, this wasn't about the mailbox. This was about control. The HOA didn't want compliance. They wanted obedience. They wanted people to fold the moment they got one of those red-lettered threats. They wanted fear, intimidation, silence. Well, they weren't going to get that from me. I thought about appealing the violation, but that process could take weeks. And knowing them, they'd just drag me through red tape, deny the appeal on a technicality, and fine me anyway. I wasn't interested in groveling for approval from people who thought a tilt was a tragedy. I wanted to make a statement, not just a fix, a statement. And that's when the idea hit me, not just to repair or replace my mailbox, but to transform it, to take their demand for aesthetic compliance and throw it back in their face. They wanted fancy, I'd give them legendary. They wanted regulation, I'd give them over-compliance in the most absurd, theatrical, and medieval way possible. If I was going to be punished for having a plain mailbox, then my next one was going to be anything but plain. It would be the most eye-catching, elaborate, completely over-the-top mailbox they'd ever seen. One they couldn't ignore, and one they couldn't technically deny either. I opened my laptop and started researching. I didn't just want to replace the mailbox. I wanted to fortify it. I looked up miniature castle models, garden fortress designs, and stone veneer materials. I even found a guy on Etsy selling tiny gargoyle statues perfect for a Gothic look. My plan? Build a medieval fortress around my mailbox so dramatic, even the HOA would be speechless. Because if they thought my old mailbox was unsightly, they hadn't seen anything yet. A few days after receiving the notice, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. Not because I expected reason or fairness, no, I'd already let go of that fantasy, but because I wanted to look these people in the eyes and hear them explain how a slightly tilted black mailbox was such a threat to suburban harmony. I wanted to see how far their absurdity would go. The meeting was held at the clubhouse, a bland brick building with fake flowers lining the walkway, and a sign-in sheet that asked for name, address, and reason for attendance. I scribbled mailbox issue and walked inside, already regretting every step. The room was filled with about 15 residents and the 5 members of the HOA board seated behind a long folding table like judges at some twisted game show. They started with announcements about landscaping schedules, pool access times, and a reminder that lawn flamingos and yard gnomes are not permitted, even seasonally. By the time they opened the floor to residents, my patience was hanging by a thread. When my name was called, I stood up and briefly explained the letter I'd received. I made my case politely at first. I mentioned that the mailbox met USPS regulations, that it had only minor cosmetic flaws, and that I'd made sure it complied with the guidelines when I bought it. But before I could finish, one of the board members, a wiry man in his 60s with a smug expression, cut me off. "Oh yes," he said, tapping on his laptop. "We've already reviewed your situation." He clicked something, and a projector hummed to life. A PowerPoint presentation lit up the wall. Slide 1. Mailbox Nightmares of Maple Drive. I felt my stomach drop. Slide 2. A photo of my mailbox zoomed in dramatically, with a giant red circle around the slight lean. Slide 3. A side-by-side comparison of approved models versus mine, complete with sarcastic captions like "what not to do" and "slouching doesn't suit you." The room erupted in laughter. People actually chuckled, shook their heads, even whispered comments like "yikes" and "that's embarrassing." I stood there, stunned, while a grown man gave a slideshow roast of a metal box that had done nothing wrong in its life but stand in the wrong neighborhood. The same smug board member clicked to the final slide. Resolution: replace mailbox within 7 days to avoid a $100 daily fine. I asked, "Is there an appeals process?" He smiled like a villain from a bad sitcom. "Sure," he said, "but while it's under review, the fines still accrue. So, unless you want to rack up hundreds, I suggest just complying." Complying. That was their favorite word. Not resolve, not understand. Comply. Another board member chimed in with a tone that was clearly meant to sound reasonable. "We're just trying to keep the community looking uniform and attractive. One mailbox like that and suddenly we're on a slippery slope." I resisted the urge to laugh. A slippery slope? From my mailbox? Were they worried I'd start a mailbox rebellion? That neighbors would see my slightly tilted box and suddenly everyone would start installing jungle-themed mailboxes or ones shaped like dinosaurs? The irony, of course, was that their behavior, the micromanaging, the public shaming, the slideshow mockery, was the actual embarrassment, not my mailbox. I left that meeting feeling 2 things: rage and a wild, almost giddy sense of defiance. They wanted me to bow to their artificial idea of beauty. They wanted me to fix it quietly and feel ashamed. They wanted me to obey without question. But they underestimated just how done I was with the HOA's nonsense. I didn't want to play defense anymore. I was going to go full offense. They'd given me 7 days to comply. I was going to give them a monument they'd never forget. As soon as I got home, I grabbed a notepad and started sketching. A towering stone base, faux medieval battlements, an iron flagpole with a faux family crest, maybe even a tiny drawbridge for the mail slot. I looked at online forums, watched videos on garden castles, and started contacting local contractors who specialized in decorative stonework and custom woodwork. My goal wasn't just to comply, it was to overcomply so epically that they wouldn't dare put my mailbox in another slideshow again. If I was going to get fined, I'd make it worth it. But more importantly, I wanted to expose their absurdity through the one language they seemed to understand: extreme theatrical compliance. And the countdown had begun. The night after the HOA meeting, I couldn't sleep. Not out of worry, but excitement. Something had snapped inside me, but in the best way possible. If they wanted aesthetics, they were going to get them, all right. But not the bland, cookie-cutter beauty the HOA tried to shove down everyone's throat. No, I was going to give them something dramatic, theatrical, a mailbox so legendary it belonged in a fantasy movie. I opened up my laptop and started researching medieval architecture. I studied everything from Gothic castles to Romanesque fortresses. I wasn't just thinking pretty mailbox. I was thinking defensive outpost, royal relic, magical monument, the kind of structure that looked like it belonged at the gates of a forgotten kingdom, not at the end of a suburban driveway. I began sketching ideas furiously: a round stone base, 4 miniature turrets, one on each corner, with little carved battlements, faux ivy creeping up the sides, a functioning drawbridge-style flap where the mail would go in, and perched right on top, a tiny iron gargoyle, mouth wide open, doubling as the outgoing mail slot. It was ridiculous. It was over the top, and it was perfect. The next step was sourcing the right people. I wasn't going to slap this thing together with styrofoam and paint. I wanted real craftsmanship. I called a local artisan stoneworker who specialized in decorative garden pieces and told him about the project. At first, there was a pause on the line, followed by, "You want to build a mini castle around your mailbox?" "Exactly," I said, "and I want it to look real, like something straight out of Camelot." To my surprise, he was intrigued. "We might be able to have some fun with this," he said. "You want it to be functional, though?" "Completely. I still need to receive mail, but beyond that, make it as dramatic as possible." He brought in a metalworker to help design the mailbox's internal structure, ensuring it met all USPS regulations. We didn't want the HOA to come after me for violating federal guidelines, after all. I was still technically complying, just not in the way they expected. The base was constructed using faux stone concrete panels treated to look weathered and mossy. The turrets were capped with tiny slate-style roofs, and each corner had a narrow arrow slit carved into it just for show. The main box sat at the center, surrounded by the stonework, and it had a tiny wooden drawbridge that lowered when the mail was inserted. The real cherry on top was the miniature wrought iron flagpole with a custom family crest I had designed. A mailbox icon at the center, flanked by 2 ravens, under the words, "Post Invictus," unconquered mail. It was part joke, part symbol of rebellion, and it looked majestic. As the build came together over the next few days, people walking by would stop and stare. Neighbors who normally nodded politely were now stopping to take pictures, complimenting the stonework, or asking if it was some kind of art installation. Some were laughing, some were awestruck, but no one could deny that it was a visual masterpiece. Even the mail carrier stopped her van, got out, and inspected it. "This is insane," she said, clearly impressed. "I've never delivered to a fortress before." "Only the bravest may enter," I joked. She saluted me with a smile and carried on with her route. I wasn't just making a statement. I was turning my front lawn into performance art. And the best part? It was technically compliant. The mailbox height and distance from the curb met all postal requirements. The box itself was regulation-sized and easy to access. The HOA had no real grounds to reject it. When the structure was finally completed, I placed a small plaque on the stone base. It read, "Erected in honor of aesthetics, Isonisibonyon." It was a jab, sure, but a clever one. And now, all that was left to do was wait. I didn't call the HOA. I didn't email. I just waited for one of them to pass by and see what I had done. I could only imagine the look on their faces when they saw what their ridiculous complaint had inspired. This wasn't revenge through destruction. This was revenge through creativity. I hadn't broken a single rule, but I had completely demolished their sense of control. Because when you fight nonsense with logic, they find a way around it. But when you fight nonsense with pure, unfiltered absurdity, they don't know what to do. They wanted me to replace my ugly mailbox. Well, now it had a fortress, and the battle lines were drawn. The fortress was completed just before the weekend, standing tall and proud at the end of my driveway like a sentinel of suburban defiance. I knew it was only a matter of time before the HOA noticed, but I didn't expect the storm to arrive so quickly, or so dramatically. Early the next morning, while sipping coffee in my front room, I saw her. Karen, the HOA president, in her usual pastel tracksuit, power-walking down the sidewalk with her tiny dog in tow. She was deep in conversation on her phone, oblivious to what awaited her just a few feet ahead. Then she saw it. Her face froze mid-sentence. Her jaw literally dropped. She stopped in her tracks, phone slipping from her ear, eyebrows shooting up like they were trying to escape her forehead. Her little dog barked once, then twice, like even it sensed the tension thickening in the air. Karen stood there, eyes darting over the fortress mailbox, trying to make sense of what she was looking at. The turrets, the stonework, the carved details, the tiny gargoyle sitting like a medieval bouncer at the top. She blinked hard like she was trying to wake from a dream, or a nightmare. I stepped out casually, pretending not to notice her reaction. She snapped out of her trance and stormed over to me, her face quickly shifting from shock to sheer rage. "What is that?" she demanded, gesturing wildly toward the mailbox. Is this a joke?" I shrugged innocently. "It's a mailbox. Replace the old one, just like you asked." Karen's eyes narrowed. "This is outrageous. You were told your previous mailbox didn't meet HOA aesthetic standards, and now you've built a theme park attraction." I smiled politely. Actually, I reviewed the HOA guidelines and the USPS regulations very thoroughly. This mailbox complies with every rule. Height, accessibility, distance from the curb, material durability, it all checks out. Want to see the paperwork? She looked like she might spontaneously combust. "You're mocking the HOA," she snapped. "This is not in the spirit of community standards. It's medieval cosplay." I didn't deny it. "You asked for improved aesthetics. I just gave the neighborhood something truly unique. People love it. Ask the mail carrier." Karen clenched her jaw so tightly I thought I heard her molars crack. "I'm taking this to the board. This will not stand." And with that, she spun on her heel and stormed off, her dog yipping after her like a fuzzy sidekick in a cartoon meltdown. Later that day, I received an official-looking envelope from the HOA, an emergency notice of a board meeting to discuss violations and potential remedies. I showed up, of course, armed with every regulation and receipt. There were about 7 people at the table, including Karen, looking like she had swallowed a lemon whole. She began the meeting with a dramatic slideshow, showing photos of the mailbox from different angles. She called it an eyesore, a provocation, and not in harmony with the visual values of our community. When she was finished, she looked smug, like she'd already won. But then I stood up. I laid out every detail. The USPS mailbox compliance checklist, met. The HOA's own architectural rules, met. Materials, safe, weather-resistant, non-reflective. functionality, completely intact. I even had photos of neighbors taking selfies with the mailbox and positive online comments from a local community Facebook group calling it the coolest thing on the block. Then I dropped the final bomb. And since your original complaint was about aesthetics, this structure arguably raises the visual appeal of the property more than any plastic prefab box ever could. The board members glanced at each other. A few even smirked. One elderly board member, Mrs. Rosen, leaned forward and asked, "So, it's functional, not violating any rules, and honestly, it's kind of charming. Why are we here?" Karen sputtered, "Because it undermines the authority of this board." Mrs. Rosen blinked slowly. "Or it just shows creativity within the rules." That line shifted the entire energy in the room. By the end of the meeting, it was clear I wasn't going to be ordered to remove the mailbox. The board was hesitant to push further, especially with no clear policy violations. They told me they'd review the aesthetics clause for future clarification. But as of now, the mailbox was allowed to stay. Karen looked like she might faint. And that's when I knew I'd won, not through shouting, threats, or confrontation, but through strategy, wit, and design. They had tried to control me with vague standards. I responded by building something so elaborate and meticulously compliant that their own system choked on it. And as the meeting ended and people filed out, one board member patted me on the back and said with a grin, "That's one hell of a mailbox." I smiled. It's a fortress. At first, I thought the medieval mailbox fortress would simply be a silent statement, a creative protest that would sit quietly in front of my house and annoy the HOA from a distance. I didn't expect what happened next. The community, it turned out, was starving for someone to stand up to the HOA's endless micromanagement, and my mailbox became the rallying point they never knew they needed. The reaction from neighbors was instant and overwhelming. By the end of that weekend, people were stopping their cars in front of my house just to take a look. Kids rode up on bikes and asked if they could take photos in front of it. One teenager jokingly knighted his younger brother with a stick while yelling, "By the power of the mailbox!" It was ridiculous, but in the best way. Then came the compliments. "It's the coolest thing on the block." Finally, something fun around here. I'd even caught Karen one afternoon, arms folded, begrudgingly nodding at it while speaking to a local tour group of potential home buyers. "That's our, mailbox fortress. Very unique." Oh, how the narrative had flipped. The same people who had labeled it an eyesore were now calling it an emblem of homeowner creativity. Apparently, once the HOA board got replaced, the new committee decided to lean into the story instead of fight it. They published a revised community brochure, one that featured a smiling family walking past the fortress, with the caption, "Historic charm meets modern spirit." I almost choked when I saw it. But it wasn't just the aesthetics that changed. It was the energy of the neighborhood. Before, people kept to themselves. We were all little islands, isolated by fear of breaking a rule we didn't even know existed. Now, people chatted more, shared stories. There was an invisible thread of connection now, and oddly enough, it had started with a mailbox no one could ignore. Some neighbors even started playfully upgrading their own front yards. Not to the extreme of a medieval fortress, but enough to feel like everyone was reclaiming a piece of their space. A mini pirate ship planter here, a vintage gas lamp there. Even Dave finally painted his front door neon green just to see what would happen. Nothing happened. And that was the point. For the first time in years, homeowners felt like owners, not tenants under the thumb of a glorified neighborhood dictatorship. The new board didn't just rewrite the rulebook, they rewrote the tone. They implemented quarterly creativity walks, where homeowners could showcase their lawn decor and art installations. They even ran a Yard of the Month contest, not for the most trimmed grass, but for most imaginative design. Guess who won the first one? Yep, yours truly. with a massive golden scroll tied to the drawbridge of my mailbox. But beneath the laughs and the headlines, there was something deeper. People weren't just inspired by the mailbox, they were relieved. It had proven that fighting back didn't have to be loud or aggressive. It could be clever. It could be rooted in humor. It could make a point and still make people smile. The best part? I didn't do it out of some grand plan. I did it because I was tired, fed up, and I figured if I was going to get fined anyway, I might as well enjoy it. But what came out of it was far bigger than I ever expected. I'd hear stories weeks later from new residents saying they'd chosen this neighborhood because of the mailbox. We figured if people here stand up for themselves like that, it must be a good place to live. It was surreal, but also kind of perfect. Even the mail carrier, now basically a local celebrity, started dressing in a little plastic night helmet every Friday. Just guarding the fortress, he'd joke, rain, shine, or HOA drama. And to this day, no one dares question the fortress anymore. In fact, it's become the official meeting point for block parties and holiday events. Kids play around it. Seniors sit beside it. One couple even got engaged in front of it, saying it was where they first realized this wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a community. Crazy what one act of rebellion can spark. Now, when I walk out in the morning, coffee in hand, and see my mailbox glowing gently under the sunrise, I smile. Not because I won some grand war, but because I didn't let myself get pushed around. Because I turned something petty into something powerful. And because deep down, we all want to believe that one small act, done with heart, humor, and a little bit of spite, can ripple out and make the whole street feel different. Victory didn't just arrive, it got delivered, right to the front gate of a stone-clad, flame-lit mailbox fortress that started it all. And it's still standing. This is the best middle finger to the HOA I've ever seen. People weren't just laughing, they were supporting. And that support soon turned into something more. Inspiration. 2 days later, my neighbor Dave, who'd been battling the HOA for years over the color of his front door, knocked on mine and said, "You know, I was thinking of building a drawbridge around my trash bins. Think they'd like that?" He laughed, but there was seriousness in his voice. For once, someone had proved the HOA wasn't invincible. That's when I realized something had shifted. The HOA's iron grip was cracking, and the community was pushing back. I found out through the grapevine that Karen had doubled down, going door to door to try and rally support to remove the mailbox. But instead of getting signatures, she got rolled eyes. People were tired of her obsessive enforcement, tired of being treated like tenants in a neighborhood they owned homes in. My mailbox had struck a nerve, because deep down everyone had been one HOA letter away from their breaking point. Then came the petition. A small group of neighbors, led by a guy named Marcus, who once got fined for having excessively decorative lawn gnomes, started drafting a petition to hold a vote to remove the current HOA board. According to the bylaws, it was possible, but rarely done. Most people didn't bother because they didn't think it would work. But this time, there was momentum. The mailbox fortress had made a statement. You could fight back and win. Within the week, the petition had over 60% of the required signatures. People who had stayed silent for years now felt empowered. One woman who had been fined $100 for hanging a flower basket that clashed with seasonal color palettes said, "It's time. We let them go unchecked for too long." The HOA tried to respond with their usual tactics. Karen sent out another newsletter claiming the mailbox set a dangerous precedent for nonconformity and that architectural standards exist for a reason. But it was too late. No one cared about Karen's newsletter anymore. Instead, people were showing up to HOA meetings for the first time ever. And they were angry, but organized. They asked real questions, demanded transparency, and pushed for amendments to vague aesthetic rules that had long been used as weapons. What had once been a bored, echo chamber meeting with sleepy nods and rubber-stamped violations was now a battleground of accountability. The mailbox? Still standing. Untouched. Even the mail carrier chimed in. "It's actually the most secure mailbox on my route," he told the board during a public comment session. "And honestly, it's kind of fun delivering there." It wasn't just about one man's mailbox anymore. It was about the idea behind it, the belief that homeowners should have the right to express themselves, take pride in their property, and not live in fear of letters about invisible weeds or minor fence stains. The board, sensing their power waning, tried one last desperate move. They proposed a vote to revise the aesthetic guidelines to prohibit theme structures. But the motion didn't even pass. The same people who had been rubber-stamping rules for years were now either too embarrassed or too afraid to back Karen's crusade. By the time the recall vote came around, it wasn't even close. 3 of the 5 board members, including Karen, were removed. The remaining 2 resigned voluntarily the next day. The new board? Younger, friendlier, actually interested in community improvement, not domination. Their first order of business? Rewrite the guidelines to allow creative expression as long as safety and functionality were maintained. And the mailbox? It became a local landmark. Someone added it to Google Maps as the Mailbox Fortress. A local blogger wrote a piece on it titled, "When HOA Tyranny Met Medieval Revenge." Even a neighborhood kid wrote about it for a school project called Standing Up for Yourself 101. Looking back, it still feels surreal. I didn't build a mailbox to change the world, or even the neighborhood. I built it because I was tired of being pushed around. But sometimes, all it takes is one bold act to flip the script. What started as a protest became a movement, and what was once called too ugly became the very thing that made the neighborhood beautiful again, not because of how it looked, but because of what it stood for: freedom, creativity, and a well-armored sense of humor. Victory didn't come with confetti or fireworks. It came in the quiet moments, when I'd walk to the end of my driveway, see my ridiculous stone-stacked medieval mailbox still standing tall, and realize no one dared touch it anymore. The HOA completely silent now. No more warning letters, no more citations, no more thinly veiled threats disguised as friendly reminders. Instead, the once vilified mailbox had become a neighborhood icon, a literal and metaphorical monument to standing your ground.